Good to go. Thanks everybody for coming to the 11:45 session. My friend Kari Theurer from Trinity College. I just wanted to, before that, tell my own brief Bob Richardson story, if I could. Back in 2004, when I first came here as a grad student, Kari was here as an undergrad course, and this course already finished. One day, I forget it was 2004, 2005, but one day, Robert Skipper came into the grad student office and was just chatting with us all, and mentioned that he had just been having a conversation with Bob Richardson, whom I had not met yet, not really. And he said in this kind of hushed tone, I was talking to Richardson. I was mentioning this obscure article on this only tangentially related field that I just read, and I was telling Richardson I didn't think it was very good. And Richardson said, "Oh, good. That means I don't have to read it." And Skipper said in this tone of awe, "Richardson reads everything." And that is the only time I have ever seen Skipper impressed with anything. So, here's my chapters: disorder is dysfunction, adaptationism, teleology, and psychiatry.
Thanks, Doug. All right, is this thing on? Is this thing working? Cool. All right, so first of all, I'd like to thank Tom for inviting me to do this. Bob had a tremendous impact on me as a thinker and a teacher and a scholar and a person and all the rest of it. So this is a real honor for me to be able to do. I first met Bob when I was an undergrad, as Doug said, here at UC. I was probably a third-year undergraduate biology student when I showed up in one of Bob's classes for the first time, and also Tom's and John's and Rob. I don't think Rob's here anywhere, is he? Yeah. And so I had been studying biology for most of my undergraduate career here, and I thought I wanted to be a doctor, like the real kind that helps people. But I started taking these classes in philosophy of biology and philosophy of mind with Bob and Tom and John and Rob, and kind of discovered that the questions that I thought were most interesting about biology in particular were really philosophical questions and not necessarily scientific questions. So I went home and told my parents that I was instead going to go to graduate school in philosophy. They're like, "What are you doing?" And then Bob was incredibly helpful to me then. I don't know if you remember this, I'm sure you don't, went painstakingly through my terrible writing sample on mental imagery and made it into something that was good enough to get me into graduate school. So thank you for that. And I learned a ton from Bob about teaching, about research, about scholarship. I learned that if you're going to ask somebody a devastating question, you should first disarm them with a smile, which you were brilliant at. And his work and his thinking on mechanisms, which everybody has talked about so far, on reduction, emergence, evolution, development, evolutionary psychology, and all of that stuff was incredibly important to me. Like everybody else here, discovering complexity had a huge impact on me, but so did this book. And we haven't really talked too much about Bob's work in evolutionary biology or psychology so far, and I'm going to spend my time today doing that. And I regularly teach several chapters from this book in my philosophy of biology course at Trinity. First, because it's brilliant in its critique of evolutionary psychology, but also because of something that I've come to appreciate much, much more as I've gotten older about Bob's thought and Bob's writing, which is that this book, I think, contains a really clear expression of the relationship between the origins of evolutionary biology and of political thought, which you don't really find in a lot of accessible books in biology or philosophy of biology. And so it's that relationship and intersection between biology and political thought that I'm going to spend some time talking about with you today. So, without further ado, I'm going to be talking about the concept of function in psychiatry. So the concept of dysfunction plays an essential role in psychiatry, and particularly in analyses and definitions of psychiatric disorder. Psychiatry's major diagnostic manuals, the DSM and the ICD, both characterize disorder in part in terms of dysfunction. So the DSM-5's definition of a mental disorder reads, a mental disorder is a syndrome characterized by clinically significant disturbance in an individual's cognition, emotion regulation, or behavior that reflects a dysfunction in the psychological, biological, or developmental processes underlying mental functioning. Socially deviant behavior and conflicts that are primarily between the individual and society are not mental disorders unless the deviance or conflict results from a dysfunction in the individual. The definition in the ICD-11 is nearly identical to that one. Both definitions have these two main clauses. So first, any putative disorder has to involve a clinically significant disturbance in cognition, emotion regulation, behavior, whatever. And second, that disturbance has to reflect an underlying psychological, biological, or developmental dysfunction. And it's that second clause, and particularly the concept of biological dysfunction, that's going to be my focus today. Now, those ideas are also central to the NIH's more recent research domain criteria project, the goal of which is to understand the nature of mental health and illness in terms of varying degrees of dysfunctions in general psychological or biological systems. Now, all of these include, as a necessary condition, this idea that any putative disorder has to reflect an underlying dysfunction. And so today I'm going to focus on that clause, and particularly on the role that biological dysfunction plays. So what's missing here, I think, is an account of the concept of dysfunction, which is important because without it, there is no satisfactory way to distinguish between genuine dysfunction or disorder and functional or healthy variations in how people think or feel or behave. And that's really, really important for a profession or a discipline that aims to catalog and taxonomize legitimate disorders rather than just normal variations in how people think, behave, and live. Accounts of dysfunction inevitably rely on some underlying concept of function. And so today I'm going to consider whether there is an account of function that can make sense of these definitions of disorder, and let's do the work that psychiatry would implicitly demand. And that, I think, is what would ultimately demarcate genuine dysfunction from normal variation and would thus serve as the ultimate justification for inclusion of a condition in the DSM or the ICD. That is what would explain why it's a disorder rather than just another way of being. So I'm going to argue that two primary ways of interpreting functional language in philosophy both suffer from serious problems in the context of psychiatry and probably medicine more generally. And I'm going to focus most of my attention today on accounts that attempt to understand psychiatric functioning in terms of selected effects, that is, in terms of natural selection. And I'm going to argue that one widely accepted account of psychiatric disorder, Jerome Wakefield's harmful dysfunction account, imports into psychiatry an unwarranted and implausible assumption, an adaptationist assumption, that we ought to reject. Namely, that the psychological, biological, or developmental mechanisms that underlie normal or healthy psychiatric functioning are in fact evolutionary adaptations. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm first going to quickly walk through the history of the dysfunction clause. I think it's important to know why it's there. What are you asking me to do, Doug?
I was just verifying the screen ought to be white.
Oh yeah, there's almost nothing on slides in this talk, just quotes. So I don't really do that anymore. So first I'm going to walk through the history of the dysfunction clause. And then I'm going to consider two possible interpretations of functional language in psychiatry and sketch the implications for each of those for understanding dysfunction in psychiatry. One approach offers a causal or mechanistic interpretation of function and dysfunction. The second is grounded in natural selection. And I'm then going to argue that neither interpretation is up to the task of demarcating between disorder and natural variation. I'll then narrow my focus to one particular account of disorder, the harmful dysfunction account, and argue that it imports into psychiatry an unwarranted and implausible assumption that we ought to reject. Namely, that the psychological, biological, and developmental mechanisms underlying normal or healthy functioning are in fact evolutionary adaptations. That is, I'm going to argue that Wakefield's harmful dysfunction account, which is widely accepted, is implicitly adaptationist, and I'll then offer some theoretical considerations from evolutionary biology against the assumption that those mechanisms are indeed adaptive. And I'll then argue that those accounts entail a set of strong empirical claims that are, at least so far, largely unsupported by the evidence. And I'll conclude by suggesting that this is a version of a much older and more fundamental problem of locating teleology in the natural world, and that psychiatry's current answer to that question, in fact, serves to legitimize a social, political, and economic order that is, in fact, the real root cause of much of human suffering that psychiatry at least nominally aims to treat. So, first, about this dysfunction clause, I want to say a few things about how that came to be and how it came to play such an important role in psychiatry in the first place. So, the dysfunction clause was incorporated into the DSM with the DSM-3 in 1980. So by 1980, dysfunction and disorder were understood to be so tightly linked that Robert Spitzer, the chairman of the task force charged in 1978 with rewriting the DSM, remarked then that our approach makes explicit an underlying assumption that is present in all discussions of disease or disorder, that is, the concept of organismic dysfunction. Now, that was in many ways a response to criticisms of psychiatry articulated by Foucault and Saz and others. And those thinkers argued, in various ways, that psychiatry had pathologized certain ways of being that ought not be pathologized, including things like homosexuality. Now, one source of controversy was the question of whether psychiatric disorders are ultimately grounded in social norms or natural facts. Constructivists about psychiatric disorder argue that disease and disorder concepts are inelimitably normative in some way, and on that view, determinations about whether a particular cluster of psychiatric symptoms ought to count as disordered can't be made independently of human interests and values. Naturalists, on the other hand, argue that disorders are grounded in biological function or dysfunction or some kind of other naturalistically respectable function or dysfunction, which are understood to be independent of human values and activities or purely scientific in some way. And some people like Wakefield try to have it both ways by incorporating a component of each of those into the account. More on that in a minute. So the addition of that dysfunction clause is one way of building a particular sort of naturalism into the profession's understanding of disorder. And up until the publication of the DSM-3, the DSM had taken what they call an atheoretical stance about the etiology and nature of disorder, debates about which had consumed the profession for a long time. Now, that stance, like anything else, wasn't really atheoretical, but that's what they said. So, importantly, the dysfunction clause serves to locate the source of the condition in the organic functioning of the person, rather than in the environment. And that's thought to be important because, for example, a gay person living in a society that's bigoted against gay people would obviously feel some real and appropriate distress in response to that fact. But in that case, in cases like that, the problem is clearly not in the person, it's in the society in which they find themselves. And it would be a mistake to classify the person rather than the environment as the thing that's disordered. And so for reasons like that, the authors of the DSM thought that it was important to include the dysfunction clause so as to locate the source of the disorder in the organic functioning of the person, their psychology, their biology, their development, rather than on the basis of prevailing social norms. Now, the dysfunction clause is also intended to distinguish psychiatric disorder from negative or unpleasant, but totally normal, expectable, or healthy parts of life. Things like grief following death or divorce. As Wakefield describes it, the dysfunction requirement is necessary to distinguish disorders from any other types of negative conditions that are part of normal functioning, like ignorance, grief, and normal reactions to stressful environments. So far I've been talking a lot about dysfunction. Whatever that is will depend in some way on an underlying concept of function. And accounts of function in psychiatry, for the most part, tend to fall into two groups, which will be familiar to philosophers of mind and science in the room. And now, before you get angry, I'm not saying that there's only two possible options. Okay, there are others, but these are the two that I have tended to find the most often in psychiatry, and that I think are implicit in a lot of work. So one account of function understands it in terms of causal roles. So any causal contribution that a component of a system makes to that system counts as a function. I'll refer to that, as we often do, as the causal role account, which, as most of you already know, is most strongly associated with Rob Cummins. And that account of function is thoroughly causal rather than teleological. In the context of psychiatry, the causal mechanical view would suggest that a psychiatric disorder is any failure of a causal or mechanical system to do what it does as it pertains to psychiatric functioning. Ken Schaffner argues that functions in psychiatry should be understood in roughly that way. And however useful that account is in other areas of science, and I think it probably is, it runs into problems in the context of psychiatry and maybe in medicine more generally. And the biggest problem with it is its permissiveness. So most anything that a system does can be characterized as a function depending on what it's compared to. So for example, in addition to pumping blood, the heart produces sound also. And so the causal role account would seem to imply, or at least have a hard time explaining why it is, that the function of the heart isn't also to make noise, right? So however useful the Cummins account of function might be in other areas of science, I think it's going to struggle to make sense of function and dysfunction as they appear in psychiatry, because if anything that a component does in a system counts as a function, then its function will turn out to be whatever it happens to do, which isn't very helpful if the goal is to distinguish healthy systems from disordered ones, because there is no normative component of that theory that could demarcate in a non-arbitrary way what the system is supposed to do from what it isn't, and therefore healthy from disordered functioning. Now, Schaffner takes the additional step of arguing that the value of functional language in psychiatry is merely heuristic. So while medicine might appear to posit functions as real and ineliminable features of the natural world, functional language drops out of the explanation once a complete mechanistic explanation can be given. I don't think you need to say that, but that's what he happens to say. So he writes, this is Schaffner, if and when we achieve a complete and simple dynamic or mechanistic explanation, the need for a designer interpretation becomes attenuated, and with it, the appropriateness of functional language. So functions then, for Schaffner at least, are of purely heuristic value. In this context, they act as a placeholder for deeper mechanistic explanations. Now, Schaffner's particular interpretation of this, according to which functional talk drops out of the explanation once a complete mechanistic explanation can be given, faces a special problem when it is applied to accounts of disorder found in the DSM and the ICD. Because if he's right that functional talk drops out of a sufficiently fleshed out mechanistic explanation, then that talk, including the language of dysfunction, can't really play any essential or at least unique role in our understanding of disorder. It can't add anything to the explanation that a detailed mechanistic explanation wouldn't also add. And if functional talk is merely heuristic, then whatever it adds to psychiatry's account of disorder, that too would be merely heuristic. And thus it can't serve to locate the dysfunction, the distinction between disordered and healthy psychiatric functioning in a real feature of the natural world. And it certainly couldn't do the job of explaining why something like homosexuality ought not count as a disorder. So, on a Schaffnerian interpretation of dysfunction, it's hard to see how the dysfunction clause could do the thing that it was originally intended to accomplish. So, I'm going to spend, that's all I'm going to say really about Schaffner and the causal mechanical account. Most of what I'm going to talk about has to do with adaptationism and selected effects. So, the second way of understanding function in psychiatry, which is more popular, I think, is to interpret it as a feature of the natural world that's grounded in evolution. That camp, associated with Ruth Millikan and others, understands function in terms of selected effects rather than causal roles. And on that selected effects account, the function of a trait is what that trait was selected to do by natural selection. Now, there are two versions of that account. One's backward-looking, the other's forward-looking. The backward-looking version identifies the function of a trait by its selection history. The forward-looking account suggests that the functions derive from a present propensity or tendency to succeed under selection. Bigelow and Pargetter's propensity theory is a good example of that. And on that view, the function of the heart is to pump blood because in those organisms with hearts, the movement of blood through the circulatory system increases an organism's propensity to survive and reproduce in the present and future rather than explain why it was selected for in the past. So, while the causal role account might be understood to be too permissive, as I argued above, there's a sense in which the selected effects account might be too restrictive. So a trait only has a function if it was directly selected for by natural selection. And yet it's sometimes tempting to suppose that traits have functions even in the absence of that very specific type of evolutionary history. So for example, feathers aid in flying, even though that's not what they were initially selected to do, strictly speaking. And if a trait appears through some other evolutionary mechanism other than natural selection, on that account, it cannot by definition have a function. Now, a third group has tried to steer a middle ground or maybe an alternative path between those two camps. For example, Borst argues that the function of a trait is the statistically typical causal contribution of that trait to an organism's survival and reproduction. I think there are other problems with that. Rachel Cooper has articulated some of those problems, I think, quite convincingly. And I'm not going to be focused on those problems today. Now, the most visible expression of the selected effects account function in psychiatry can be found in Wakefield's work. And some version of that is pretty explicit in his harmful dysfunction account of disorder in that original 1992 paper and some papers that came after. And that account of disorder is designed to strike a balance between accounts that understand disorder as a normative concept grounded in value judgments and those like Borst's that understand it as a purely scientific and allegedly value-free concept. And it does that by splitting the concept of disorder into two components, one of which is purely normative, the harm component, and the other which is supposedly purely scientific, the dysfunction component. And that supposedly perfectly purely scientific conception of dysfunction is grounded straightforwardly in his account in natural selection. So he argues that two conditions have to be met in order for a condition to count as a disorder. First, it has to have negative consequences for the person. That is, it has to be harmful. That's the normative component. And second, it has to be one in which I'm missing something. It has to be one in which there is some internal dysfunction, and that's the part of the account that's intended to be purely scientific. So, I want to note here, too, that sometimes Wakefield talks in terms of design, which bothers me for obvious reasons. I think it just means that as a useful way of talking about the products of natural selection rather than like literal design. So that's not where I'm going to go in my critique of his account here. So his account raises the natural question of how he understands dysfunction. So he writes, a reasonable supposition is that a dysfunction implies an unfulfilled function, so that a dysfunction represents the failure of some mechanism in the organism to perform its function. So dysfunction is a failure of function, but what is function? He writes, the only functions that are relevant to evaluation of dysfunction are the natural functions of mechanisms. The most viable approach is based on the notion of evolutionary design. Certain mechanisms are naturally selected because of the beneficial effects that the mechanisms have on the organism's fitness, and those beneficial effects are the natural functions of those mechanisms. The natural function, then, is not just any benefit or effect provided by a mechanism, but a benefit or effect that explains, through evolutionary theory, why the mechanism exists or why it has the form that it does. It may be concluded that the proper analysis of dysfunction, failure of a mechanism in the person to perform a natural function for which the mechanism was designed by natural selection. And this, he says, is a purely scientific concept. So I think that's a clear endorsement of something like the selected effects account of function. And elsewhere, he states explicitly that mental disorders are harmful failures of naturally selected functions. So disorder is understood primarily in terms of dysfunction, which is understood as the failure of function, where function is understood as the benefit or effect that the thing was naturally selected for, and thus explains why, evolutionarily, that trait exists in a population. So we've connected disorder to dysfunction, dysfunction to function, and function to natural selection. So far I've argued that psychiatry lacks a coherent account of function and dysfunction, but that it needs one, so long as the concept of dysfunction is an essential component of accounts of disorder. Without that, it'll struggle to demarcate disordered conditions from non-disordered conditions in a non-arbitrary way. And at least it will struggle to locate the problem in the person rather than in the environment when it belongs there, as the dysfunction clause was originally intended to do. So what I'm going to do next is argue that attempts to understand psychiatric functions in terms of selected effects means that the mechanisms in question that are prone to dysfunction would be best understood on that view as adaptations. So there are different definitions of what constitutes an adaptation, and those can be roughly grouped into two camps. One is historical, the other is ahistorical, which reflects that distinction between the forward-looking and backward-looking versions of the selected effects account. So on an engineering account of adaptation, a trait is best understood as an adaptation for a particular task if it is correct to consider a character as an adaptation for a particular task only if there is some evidence that it has evolved, been modified during its evolutionary history in specific ways to make it more effective in the performance of that task, and that the change has occurred due to the increased fitness that results. That's West Aberhard's understanding of that account of adaptation. In a similar vein, Lisa Lloyd, who also taught me, writes that adaptations are traits that have evolved to serve a particular fitness-enhancing role, and that is why they are prevalent. So on the engineering account, selection history is an essential consideration in determining whether a trait's an adaptation for a particular task. That's contrasted with the ahistorical view, which conceives of adaptation as a difference between two phenotypic traits or complexes of traits, which increases the inclusive fitness of its carrier. And historical evidence is unnecessary on that view. So all that would be needed is evidence that a trait presently contributes to fitness. So Lloyd refers to those as the historical and current fitness approaches to adaptation. Now, whether they're forward-looking or backward-looking isn't really that important here. But what is common, or what's important, is what's common to both, the requirement that the trait enhances fitness. So when Wakefield argues that certain mechanisms are naturally selected because of the beneficial effects that the mechanisms have on the organism's fitness, and explain through evolutionary theory why the mechanism exists or why it has the form that he does, and that is why those traits have their function, what he's talking about, somewhat indirectly, is adaptation. It's the status of those traits as adaptive that gives them their function. And that way of thinking about the connection between function and adaptation is pretty standard. In fact, whether a trait is best understood as an adaptation is often taken to be a proxy for questions about the trait's function. Tom and I have written some things about that. But that has to be done very carefully, because merely explaining how and why evolutionarily a trait exists or persists in a population doesn't immediately warrant any conclusion about the trait's function. For there are lots of modes of evolutionary explanation that are totally silent about the trait's function. And so you can't conclude from the fact that a trait's commonplace that it's adaptive, and thereby that it was selected for because that trait had a differential effect on fitness, as Wakefield seems to assume. Only if the trait has had a differential effect on fitness can we reasonably conclude that there is something that the trait does to achieve that result, after which we could infer that it's an adaptation for something. Now, there's a wide range of views about the importance and centrality of adaptation in natural selection and evolution. Those who see natural selection as the only or the most important evolutionary force to consider are referred to as adaptationists. And from the adaptationist point of view, we should at least start with the assumption that the traits we see are there because they are fitness enhancing. Now, Wakefield's view doesn't imply that everything is an adaptation, but his account, I think, as well as any other that understands psychiatric function in terms of selected effects, implies a very strong set of empirical claims about our actual evolutionary history. And those claims are testable, and as I'm going to argue in a little bit, so far in large part unsupported by the data. Those accounts entail that psychiatric dysfunction is rooted in the failure of some mechanism to bring about the effects for which it was naturally selected. And likewise, healthy or normal psychiatric functioning is that in which those mechanisms do, in fact, bring about the effects for which they were naturally selected. Healthy or non-disordered psychiatric systems, then, are those in which the relevant cognitive, behavioral, neurological, or biological systems are doing what those systems were naturally selected to do. And disordered psychiatric symptoms are, then, those in which those naturally selected for mechanisms have failed to do whatever it is that they were selected to do. So if that view is correct, then it would follow that those biological mechanisms that are generative of or constitutive of the healthy condition, and which are dysfunctional in the case of a disordered condition, are necessarily the products of natural selection. That is, that the things that represent the healthy condition are evolutionary adaptations. Now, the temptation is to assume that the traits governing healthy psychiatric functioning are necessarily adaptations, and then to reverse engineer the ancestral and environmental conditions that would have generated the relevant selection pressures. So if something like depression is best understood as a disruption in those naturally selected mechanisms, it would have to be the case that the healthy or non-depressive mood regulation in a person is something that was selected for in our evolutionary past because it afforded its bearers some important fitness advantage. Now, note too that this claim is not that depression itself must have been an adaptation, which people have asked me before. That's not what I'm saying. Or that depression is necessarily maladaptive. I don't think that's true either. The claim is only that non-disordered conditions are adaptations. So his view then would be adaptationist insofar as every instance of a mental disorder is an instance of a fitness-enhancing mechanism failing to do what it evolved to do under natural selection. That is, it assumes that the mechanisms underlying non-disordered mental and behavioral functioning are in fact adaptations. Now, I think two additional commitments follow from that. First, that mechanisms that are not the products of natural selection can't be properly categorized as either functional or dysfunctional, and therefore as healthy or disordered. That would be a kind of category mistake if it's true that the only mechanisms selected for by natural selection are the ones that have functions. And alternative ways that selected mechanisms might function, say in response to stressful events or to trauma or problems in development, wouldn't be dysfunctional or therefore disordered either, even if they were to cause massive harm to the person. Nor could such mechanisms be properly understood as dysfunctional, even if they were to generate a cluster of symptoms exactly identical to another cluster generated by a mechanism failing to do what it was naturally selected to do, simply because it would have the wrong kind of origin. So second, systems that evolve via some alternative mechanism of evolution couldn't be prone to dysfunction because they would lack the right kind of origin, and those mechanisms couldn't be said to be disordered either. Now, I think there are lots of reasons to be cautious about that kind of reasoning. And in my remaining time, I'm going to argue that that commitment to adaptationism makes a number of assumptions about the evolutionary history of our brains that are implausible and unsupported by the evidence. And next, I'm going to articulate some theoretical considerations for thinking that that's true. So, there aren't a lot of good reasons to assume that the mechanisms relevant to cognitive, emotional, and behavioral functioning, that is, the kinds of mechanisms that are of particular interest to psychiatrists, are in fact the products of natural selection in the way that Wakefield's account would seem to imply, that is, that they are adaptations. The problem with that methodology is that it assumes uncritically that natural selection is the primary driver of evolutionary change. But natural selection is, of course, only one of many mechanisms of evolution, and the prevalence of a trait in a population is no clear indication of its adaptiveness. Traits can even proceed to fixation in a population in the complete absence of differential selection. So there are lots of examples of alternative mechanisms of evolution, like genetic drift, so-called spandrels, to use Gould and Lewontin's terminology. Bob introduced me to that paper long ago. Things like pleiotropy or allometry are other examples of how that occurs. Other correlations are mechanically forced, as is the case with the existence of chins. Other traits, things like male nipples, appear as byproducts of development. Still other traits are exaptations, that is, traits that originally evolved for one purpose, but then were co-opted by evolution to serve another. Feathers, again, to return to that example, initially evolved to aid in thermoregulation, but were only later co-opted to aid in flight. And finally, there are traits that originated because of the organism's BAL plan or basic body plan. So bilateral symmetry wasn't selected for in humans in that way. It was baked into the body plan long before we evolved as a species. So there are just a few of those examples. There are lots of other mechanisms of evolution besides those. But the important part is that not every trait is an adaptation. And that's true for a great many phenotypic characters. None of the examples that I just discussed were neurobiological ones, and you might think maybe that a different set of rules would apply for the evolution of minds and brains, but I think there are lots of problems with that. So first, and most obviously, it would certainly be weird if adaptationism were the wrong way to think about how bodies evolved and the right way to think about how brains evolved, given that brains are parts of bodies and have evolved alongside them. The same set of evolutionary mechanisms would have to govern both. And there's no special set of rules for the evolution of brains that doesn't apply to other bodily systems too. Second, the adaptationist approach to mental functioning seems to struggle to make sense of why certain psychiatric conditions are worthy of inclusion in the DSM, because the mechanisms that function differently in those cases simply didn't evolve to do what we use them for now. So, for example, dyslexia involves difficulty in reading ability, and similarly for other learning disorders. But I think it would be a mistake to say that the mechanisms that fail to develop as we'd expect in those cases are ones that evolve specifically for reading, because the mechanisms involved evolved long before written language appeared on the scene. Third, and finally, I think there are reasons to think that the adaptationist approach isn't even a plausible approach to somatic disorder either. And it's easy enough to multiply counterexamples. It seems reasonable enough to count extremely high blood pressure, for example, as disordered, given the negative health outcomes that can result from it. But you'd have to have kind of a weird view of selection to think that normal blood pressure could necessarily be counted as an adaptation, simply because you don't need to appeal to it in order to understand why blood pressures in healthy animals tend to fall into a particular range. Circulatory systems have pumps, and perhaps the existence of those pumps is something that was selected for. But the laws of physics require that the fluid pumped through them be in a closed system under pressure. And that doesn't entail that the pressure in the system, whatever it was directly selected for because of some differential effect on fitness. Similarly for lots of other disorders. So for example, endometriosis, which I have, is a disorder in which the usual mechanisms of menstruation in humans are disrupted, sometimes severely, when endometrial-like tissue grows outside of the uterus. And there are currently active disputes about the nature and cause of that disruption, but menstruation itself is not, by most accounts, an adaptation. Most animals don't do it. Its evolutionary etiology has yet to be decisively determined, and for decades, scientists thought that something so essential to human reproduction must have conferred some important selective advantage. Those hypotheses were often grounded in the wholly unscientific assumption that women are dirty, and later that men are dirty. But the current leading hypothesis suggests that menstruation developed as a necessary byproduct of the way in which the human reproductive system is constructed. Perhaps because it's energetically more efficient to shed endometrium rather than absorb it, or maybe because the endometrium has thickened considerably in human beings as opposed to other animals, or as a result of the spontaneous decidualization of human endometrium. None of those hypotheses suggest that menstruation itself conferred any adaptive benefit whatsoever. And that's one of many examples of somatic disorders that are not obviously examples of some naturally selected for mechanism failing to do what it was designed to do. And shout out to the anonymous reviewer who explained to me that my own body was failing to perform its naturally selected functions. That was nice. I love to hear that. So, there are lots and lots of instances of somatic disorders that aren't obviously instances of some naturally selected for mechanism failing to do what it was designed to do. So, what should we conclude from that? Well, not every trait that's prevalent in a population is there because it was fitness enhancing. And so the fact that those now important brain mechanisms exist tell us nothing about why they're there or whether they were, missing one. Well, whatever. Whether they were naturally selected because of the beneficial effects that the mechanisms have on the organism's fitness. So given the availability and perhaps even the plausibility of alternative hypotheses, I don't think psychiatry is warranted in assuming that the mechanisms underlying non-disordered cognitive, behavioral, or emotional functioning are necessarily adaptations. So the question now becomes an empirical one of whether the mechanisms that underlie healthy, non-disordered psychiatric functioning are the products of natural selection or of something else. Demonstrating that a trait is or is not a product of natural selection is not an armchair exercise. Whether a trait is a product of selection is an empirical question, and there are clear standards of evidence for determining whether or not a trait is a product of natural selection. So demonstrating empirically that a trait is an adaptation is much more difficult and much messier than lots of people would like to believe that it is. And now I'm going to try to find my spot here. Here we are. So West Eberhard again writes, it's correct to consider a character an adaptation for a particular task only if there is some evidence that it has evolved, been modified during its evolutionary history in specific ways to make it more effective in the performance of that task. And that change has occurred due to the increased fitness that results. Now, certain varieties of evidence are especially important to be able to produce. And next, I'm going to articulate those standards and argue that in lots of cases in psychiatry, those have not yet been met. And I'll argue that that we currently don't have good empirical evidence to believe that the selectionist account of non-disordered psychiatric functioning is true in a general sense, which is what you would need for an account to work. So first, you need evidence that a trait has a heritable basis. That is, that it's passed biologically from generation to generation. Second, you have to demonstrate that there was, in fact, variation in the environment. That is, that there were alternatives in the ancestral population for selection to choose from. Third, you have to show that the trait actually had a differential effect on fitness, and that the ancestral environment really did exert the relevant selection pressures. Fourth, you have to offer a causal explanation that links the trait to differential reproductive success. And fifth, and finally, the hypothesis that a trait is an adaptation should be independently corroborated through experiments that would experimentally manipulate either the environment or the trait itself, and establish different trait variations in linking them to greater reproductive success in different environments. Now, if we take those standards of evidence seriously, and as good naturalists and empiricists, I think we all should, we don't yet have sufficient empirical evidence to think that many psychiatric disorders, maybe even any, are cases of adaptive mechanisms failing to do what they were naturally selected to do. And here's why. So first, consider what I said about variation in the environment and differential reproductive success. If a trait genuinely enhances fitness, its frequency in a population will tend to increase, at least in the absence of selection pressure in the other direction, and sometimes, though not always, to fixation. Likewise, the frequency of trait variants that tend to decrease fitness will also decrease. So here, the prevalence of certain psychiatric disorders presents an obvious puzzle. If, for example, depression and anxiety really reflect disruptions in fitness-enhancing mechanisms that would otherwise contribute to reproductive success, then it's hard to understand why so many of us, including myself, are depressed and anxious, and so few of us are happy, calm, and well-adjusted. Next, consider heritability and causal mechanism. If the mechanisms governing healthy psychiatric functioning were evolutionary adaptations, then we would expect, first, that we would have identified the mechanisms that govern healthy psychiatric functioning, the dysfunction of which results in disorder, or that we would have at least made some significant progress in that direction. And second, that those mechanisms have a heritable biological basis, rather than a social, developmental, cultural, or learned one. Traits that are not grounded in a heritable biological entity, genes or otherwise, are invisible to selection. And the biggest obstacle to meeting those first two evidential standards is that the bulk of current research in psychiatry is not on healthy or non-disordered mechanisms at all, much less on their status as evolutionary adaptations. Psychiatry, for the most part, doesn't really invest in research concerning the functional mechanisms, preferring to focus on the dysfunctional ones, which makes sense. It's a branch of medicine, not a branch of biology. And even in the case of dysfunctional mechanisms, the research that psychiatry has produced has revealed very little. There is no shortage of studies attempting to link specific disorders to specific dysfunctional gene variants or to clusters of gene variants and to the underlying causal mechanisms that they're involved in. But there are still no reliable biomarkers for any disorder that's listed in the DSM. Studies attempting to establish anatomical abnormalities have been really difficult to replicate. Sometimes when the sample size is increased enough to be scientifically satisfactory, the effect washes out. Studies attempting, moving on. The discovery of new drugs to treat disorders has mostly stalled, as somebody was talking about this yesterday, Jackie, maybe, because the underlying biology, they've said explicitly, is just too complicated. And in some cases, we understand the mechanisms of the existing drugs that we have, but we don't really know how they alleviate the symptoms of disorder, as is the case with antidepressants. And in a lot of cases, they don't really work at all, and nobody really seems to know why. So those problems suggest, I think, that psychiatry hasn't had great success linking disorders to underlying biological causes, much less to link them to disruptions in naturally selected mechanisms, which this account seems to require. And in many cases, we don't actually know which genes or basic brain mechanisms are prone to dysfunction and implicated in disorder, much less whether or not they were ones that were naturally selected. Now, one might reasonably wonder whether certain biological structures and mechanisms, like the HPA axis, present an obvious counterexample. Dan Hartner, who many of you know and taught, originally raised this objection with me. We had a nice fight about it. The HPA axis is widely thought to be implicated in mood regulation and thus in the development of certain psychiatric disorders, including anxiety disorders, bipolar disorder, insomnia, PTSD, borderline personality disorder, ADHD, major depressive disorder, and lots of others. So you might think that this is a rather obvious case of an adaptive mechanism, the dysfunction of which is implicated in multiple disorders. And the HPA axis is obviously certainly important in the etiology and origin of those things, but whether or not the HPA axis and its capacities are the products of natural selection is a separate question. Adaptations are always selected for something. If the HPA axis were selected for mood regulation, then there must have been something that it did in their evolutionary past that increased fitness. Moreover, if it's selection that endowed the HPA axis with the functions that are of interest to psychiatry in particular, for example, mood regulation, then it has to have been the case that mood regulation was fitness enhancing and that its fitness enhancing effect is what explains the presence of the HPA axis in us, as I talked about earlier. The problem with that kind of armchair theorizing about the origins of something like the HPA axis is that its mood regulating effects are not what explains its presence in us. Because the HPA axis is much older, evolutionarily speaking, than mood, and was selected for a very different set of fitness enhancing effects. So the HPA axis is a very, very old physiological system, evolutionarily speaking, and plays an important role in mediating organismal responses to change in the environment. And the proteins, gene products, and signaling pathways, mechanisms, whatever, that make it up were present in the first vertebrates to appear on the scene and would have been selected initially for its more basic functions relevant to the detection of change in the environment via neurotransmitters and neuromodulators that coordinate behavioral and autonomic responses to stress. And it's been maintained over evolutionary time by natural selection. But recall that selection requires the presence of population level variation. So by the time that human-like moods that were prone to dysfunction would have developed, the HPA axis would have been so deeply ingrained in the body plan and neurobiological development of vertebrates that selection for mood-regulating effects would have been impossible, simply because there were no alternatives for selection to choose from. In that sense, the HPA axis is a lot more like bilateral symmetry than it is like the specialized beaks of Darwin's finches. It's not there because of mood regulation. It's there because by the time mood came about, it couldn't not have been. And therefore, it can't be the case that the function of the HPA axis is mood regulation, at least not in the sense required by natural selected effects accounts of function, which Wakefield's account of disorder and perhaps more of psychiatry implicitly invokes. Now, I'm not arguing that the HPA axis is not a product of natural selection, right? But that its capacities that are relevant to psychiatry in particular don't seem to be things that were adaptations. So, to wrap up, I've argued that the definitions of disorder listed in the DSM and the ICD lack an analysis of dysfunction, but that they need one in order to properly demarcate disorder from healthy variation in human thought, feeling, and behavior. I've argued that the two most obvious ways of making sense of functional language in psychiatry have serious problems. Specifically, neither outcome yields an interpretation of the dysfunction clause that could bring about the intended effect of locating psychiatric dysfunction in the organic functioning of the person in any satisfactory way. So, why does it matter whether psychiatry is ultimately adaptationist or whether the mechanisms that underlie tendencies and behaviors relevant to psychiatric diagnosis really are adaptive? I think it matters insofar as we are in effect appealing to evolutionary science in order to draw conclusions about the ways we ought to be from the way things are or how they came to be. But importing into the science a set of uncritically accepted adaptationist assumptions and the attendant just so stories that accompany them, we presume uncritically that the non-dysfunctional condition is adaptive. But that's not always obviously the case. And building a psychiatric taxonomy on that set of assumptions, especially without the requisite evolutionary evidence that you would need to support those categorizations, risks getting some things very, very wrong. Specifically, I think it risks importing into that taxonomy a set of unjust social practices and preferences. And that's an old problem of psychiatry's, obviously, but it's made all the more pernicious by dubious claims about these ways of demarcating health and disorder that are grounded in a purely scientific set of facts about our evolutionary history. I don't think it's purely scientific. So the concepts of function and dysfunction, and therefore the accounts of disorder in which they figure, seem as though they are inherently teleological. And the problem is one of explaining how that could be, and perhaps of suitably naturalizing it. Psychiatry has grappled with that problem for a long time, as has the rest of medicine, at least since Aristotle. And perhaps the most successful attempt to explain away the appearance of teleology in the natural world began with Darwin and his contemporaries. So it's unsurprising that one influential and supposedly clean way of naturalizing that teleology appeals to natural selection. But there are clear limits to that strategy. Attempting to locate psychiatric functioning in naturally selected effects without an explicit understanding of and appreciation for the mechanisms of evolutionary change and the products that it yields will inevitably generate explanations that are confused at best and dangerous at worst. We are in effect appealing to a confused picture of evolutionary science in order to draw conclusions about ways we ought to be from mistaken claims about our own evolutionary history. Now consider, and I'm almost done, I know I'm probably over time. Consider what those explanations would have looked like for an earlier version of the DSM. It's easy enough to concoct scientifically dubious just-so stories that would explain why gay people, trans people, slaves who ran away from their masters, and so-called sexual deviants are best understood as disordered, as psychiatry once did. Those now seem like obviously unscientific attempts to pathologize perfectly healthy, normal, and/or rational behaviors. One way of articulating what's gone wrong in those cases is to think of them as imposing teleology where there is none, to claim that those are violations in the natural, and by natural, of course, we mean patriarchal, heteronormative, and capitalist order of things. Recent attempts to purge psychiatry of teleology, I think, are a step in the right direction, but unwarranted and uncritical appeals to adaptation and natural function like Wakefield's and others like it threaten to covertly reintroduce teleology under the guise of scientific respectability. Pushing back against that requires arguing that this isn't the natural order at all, as Foucault and others have done. And those and more recent attempts to purge psychiatry of teleology, I think, are good progress. But in our current situation, an important piece of that strategy has to be to push back against the reintroduction of a new and naturalized version of that teleology that's crept back in by way of the uncritical acceptance of certain mistaken ideas about evolution, its mechanisms, and its products. And that's exactly what we do when we assume that all of the mechanisms relevant to healthy psychiatric functioning are there because they're adaptive, and that things go wrong in cases of psychiatric disorders because they're interruptions in our naturally and teleologically structured brains, and that the way that our brains are built is the way that they are supposed to be in some suitably naturalized sense of the term. Unwarranted and uncritical appeals to adaptation and natural function in our understanding of disorder, particularly without the requisite sorts of evidence normally used to ground those judgments, threaten to covertly reintroduce into psychiatry a dangerous form of teleology under the guise of scientific respectability. Thank you. Nice questions only, please.
Yes.
Hi. Thanks.
I have a question about your thoughts on sort of the flip side of some of this. So a lot of times people talk about in psychiatry and psychology, people talk about dysfunction as the source of a lot of these problems. But sometimes people will flip the script and they'll say, look, there's a reason why there's so much depression in our society. Depression is something that we actually selected for, right? So sometimes there's this story that depression allows us to focus on problems and overcome them and whatever. And that it's actually because we're functioning well, that suddenly the environment has changed and now there's the right kind of fit, that it's fallen, that we've created some sort of dysfunction. It seems like there's a different way that people are co-opting the same type of language, the same type of story, in order to justify the widespreadness of certain sorts of features. Right, so there's a way in which we've evolved successfully to do certain things, and now suddenly it's become a problem. Does that come up in this sort of way that you think about the role of adaptationism influencing psychiatry and psychology, that sort of social dimension where everything has to have a function? That's why we've developed this way, and that's why we have these disorders, because they serve some important role.
Yeah, I think both of those lines both make a similar set of mistakes, or maybe the same set of mistakes, which is the adaptationist thing. But also, I think they both make the mistake of assuming or trying to locate the source of disorder in the person, when often, and particularly in the case of depression, it's a feature of the relationship between the person and the environment that they're in. Yeah, I don't know if that's helpful, but that's my thought.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. It's really good.
Thanks.
I had a thought about maybe a possible response on behalf of the selected effects account.
Cool.
I wonder if you could possibly include in the selected effects account, in addition to its original selected effect, perhaps also its exapted effect. In other words, if the system for mood regulation was an exaptation, like feathers in a bird, from something much earlier, maybe you could understand anxiety disorders as a failure of that system not to do what it originally did, but to do what it was exapted.
Right. I was afraid somebody would ask me that. No, I think maybe that's right. I think that's plausible in some cases. I think there are limits to that strategy, though. Like, it might be the case that there are some things like that. I don't think it's enough to build an account of disorder that covers everything that you would want to put in the DSM. So I don't think it provides a way of thoroughly demarcating between disorder and non-disorder in a way that would allow you to do what the DSM or Wakefield or whoever needs for it to do. Second, those claims, too, are subject to standards of evidence that I don't think have been met. So even if that were possible, you would still have to do all the things you need to do to show that the reason why it's there in us is because it was maintained by natural selection or something like that, right? So I know that's probably not the most satisfactory answer, but that's my current thought about it. Thank you.
Yeah, hi, thank you. This talk was super cool. I'm gonna be super annoying and I kind of have like a 3-pronged question.
Oh, I love that.
So you can answer all of them or none of them, it doesn't really matter to me. So first, I'm really interested on how your account might align with what Elizabeth Barnes has to say about like a mere difference view of disability. But instead kind of like applying it to mental illness or disorder generally. Two, I really wonder if like we're taking this social approach to psychiatry generally, how it might impact treatment, and whether we would need to almost like treat systems instead of exclusively treating people. And then I also change the way that a person who is or is not diagnosed with a mental illness or a disorder, how it might change how they integrate diagnosis into like their self-narrative, and kind of what your views on any of those things are.
Yeah, I'm going to blend together the second two because I think they are related. I feel like I shouldn't say this because I just talked about it for like an hour, but I don't think this actually affects how a lot of treatment in psychiatry, actually not psychiatry, more broadly speaking, in mental health should or does operate. So there is a difference, I think, between the kinds of interventions that psychiatrists perform, which are often to give you drugs. So you sit down with a psychiatrist and they usually ask you a bunch of questions about what drugs you need, right? But for some people, in some cases, that's helpful. I mean, who doesn't like drugs? I like drugs. But you stop. But there's a whole other kind of treatment or intervention in mental health, which I think is probably completely untouched by everything that I've said, which is therapy, right? So like everything that I've said, I think is stuff that therapists already know and already do in a lot of their thinking if they're good. You know, they're always thinking about not like, oh, is this an internal dysfunction in your brain? What they're trying to figure out usually is whether there's a mismatch between you and your environment and how best to manipulate or intervene into that system to change it and make you feel better. None of that requires, and this is your third question, a diagnosis. The diagnosis is the thing they need to send to the insurance company to justify why it is that you're in treatment in the first place, and at least in the US, to have that treatment paid for. But, you know, most of the therapists that I know don't really even care all that much about what the specific label is that they attach to the person that they send to the company, the insurance company. What they care about is that they can figure out how to intervene in your life or in your thinking about your life in a way that makes you feel better or function better, right? And then you also asked about Barnes's account of disability. I don't really do disability studies, so I'm not too familiar with her account, but could you say a little bit more about what that is? I'm curious.
Yeah, so forgive me if I absolutely butcher this. But,
I won't know, so.
Yeah, so great. So generally, the way that I've kind of viewed it is, so you have like the Borsian account, which is like disorder is like harmful diversion from normal function in relation to like a age, sex, race, and like that's Borsian. And then you have Wakefield, which is kind of like the hybrid, like you would mention. So there's the normative component and then like also the physical component to it. And then Barnes comes in and says, hey, like actually disability isn't a bad difference or a good difference, it's just a mere difference. And so it's not necessarily that's only in the individual that like, for instance, if you had mobility issues that you lived in a world that every building had ramps and every thing had handrails. Like it might not actually be hard for you to get around. That seems more like a symptom of your environment rather than merely a symptom of something intrinsic about you.
Yeah, good. I've thought about that a lot. I don't have a great answer, except to say that I think psychiatry ends up treating and aiming to treat very different populations of people, some of whom have problems that really do cause severe disruptions in their life and their ability to get around. So I'm thinking like of really crippling anxiety disorders or depressive disorders or like severe cases of autism, things like that. I think there's a very big difference between those patients and I don't know, stuff like Aaron and I were talking about this yesterday, like oppositional defiance disorder, which to me at least sounds just like being a teenager, you know? And I don't know if there is one account that could explain or even that should explain why those two groups of people should be lumped into the same category, right? And I think like an account like hers would maybe explain some of those, but not the others. So probably not satisfactory either, but.
Those were great answers.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Uh-oh.
No, I really enjoyed your talk. I was curious, so if we accept that the causal role account and the selective effects account don't work, and there's no other account function.
Didn't say that.
I know you didn't. I'm putting words in your mouth.
Yes, you are.
If that is the case, are you wanting to say that all things that we currently characterize as mental disorders aren't really mental disorders? And then kind of related to that is you mentioned this, you said that there are somatic disorders that don't involve a failure to perform an evolutionary function.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, well, what made it a somatic disorder?
What makes it somatic or what makes it a disorder?
Disorder more so.
Yeah.
Like, why is it? What makes it a disorder if there's no dysfunction? Like, why still call it?
I mean,
Disorder, so.
you could just go purely normative and say something ought to count as a disorder. And this isn't necessarily what I want to say, but something I'm rehearsing. You could say that a somatic thing counts as disordered if it causes significant harm to the person. And I mean, medicine and philosophy of medicine deals with this problem all the time anyway, with, say, for example, the question of medicalization and whether or not, for example, like really slow growing tumors ought to be treated or categorized as cancerous, or whether, I don't know, like disc problems in your back that, I shouldn't say problems, herniated discs that don't actually cause pain or dysfunction should be treated or even categorized as disordered because of how many people have them, right? So I think one way of doing that would be to just think of it purely in terms of harm. I'm not sure that's what I want to say, but it's what I'm trying out right now, today at noon on a whatever day this is, Friday. And then, remind me again what the first part of your question was?
I mean, it's kind of related, like, if there's the select effects and the causal role and council function don't work for mental disorders, like, should we just say there are no mental disorders? And that's why I asked the second question, because you seem like you wanted to say there were things called disorders.
Yeah, I don't think you'd have to eliminate them, but I think it's a separate question, like why it is that we need an account that encompasses all of that, right? Maybe there are different categories of things that are explained in different sorts of ways. Some of those problems result from mismatches between a person and their environment or the consequences of living in a shitty society, right? And some of the other ones really are products of some kind of internal biological dysfunction, whatever that turns out to mean. But I don't know why you would need one account to explain all of those things. The only reason that I can see is that psychiatry as a profession thinks that it has to defend or justify itself and its existence and needs some way of explaining why all of these things are treated by the same group of people. But I think that is an assumption that requires a defense.
I think Wakefield doesn't want psychiatrists to be treating it a normal breed.
Right.
He wants it to serve as a gatekeeper to prevent psychiatrists from treating it.
Yeah, but I guess I'm saying his way of distinguishing between things that belong in the domain of psychiatry and things that don't has some problems.
Thanks, Gary. I really felt the force of your worries about dysfunction. I'm just thinking of how to do without it. And one thing that came to mind was whether there could be some idea of a disease that could be articulated without problems of a dysfunction. I'm thinking of a case specifically like schizophrenia, where you can sort of identify stages, a course of a progression of symptoms, and predict later symptoms based on earlier ones as the typical age of onset.
Oh, interesting.
And there's an idea that gives the idea of some condition that's really there. And one thing that the dysfunction approach doesn't distinguish on just the harmful dysfunction part, it doesn't distinguish it from a person who has some brain lesions due to a stroke or to a car accident. And psychiatry sets those apart. I can't remember the exact way they do, but they set those apart because intuitively maybe they're more interested in these ideas of an underlying condition that might develop. And can that give you any place to go? I know it's not going to fit for all mental disorders, things we're calling disorders, but maybe for some.
Yeah, so the idea that there might be some like temporal entity that unfolds over time, and that thing is
going to give you, however you articulate that, the notion of disease. Can you do that without the kind of problematic teleology that it attends? Just a basic notion of a disorder.
I don't know, and so I'm teaching philosophy of medicine right now, and a student asked me something very similar to that the other day. Like every once in a while, a student will like ask me a question that blows my mind. Like, how? You're like 19. How did you come up with that? But that's what he asked me, and I don't know, honestly. I think maybe something like that could work. I don't really know how it would, but I'm curious about it, and maybe we could talk more.
So we have 5 minutes and 2 questions. Stuart.
Yes, great talk.
Thank you.
Ditch selective effects in this context. Completely right. But let me suggest one way that maybe role functions still have a role.
Cool.
So suppose that, the first thing we need to do is we need to appeal to moral theory, social and political philosophy, whatever it is, to decide what constitutes a good life and the variation and the kinds of things that are good lives. But let's suppose that we have something, and let me take something that's not psychiatric to make this maybe clearer. So if we have something like memory loss, right? And there's a variety of reasons why we might believe that someone who has Alzheimer's, has something that, that we would want to call a disorder because of the following thing. There are things that we take to be constitutive of human flourishing that individual may be less able to do than somebody else. And then we can say, what are the features of behavior that are are needed to be in that place of human flourishing. And what are the mechanisms responsible for that?
Yeah.
And how is the ones in the person who is less able to have that thing different from the ones that are, where you have it? And if you can look and you can find something, that is organic, then maybe that's okay. Does that make sense as a?
It does, but it sure sounds normative. I think that's the problem with it. That if that's, I like the suggestion, but if that's how you're thinking of it, then it's not. Why split the harm and the dysfunction component into one that's purely normative and one that is like purely descriptive or purely scientific or purely biological? It's not, because whatever those mechanisms are for human flourishing, whatever that is, and you can't figure out what that is without asking a whole bunch of normative questions about how best to structure a society.
Normative. I'm just saying
Yeah.
whole thing is normative, but the question is, if for whatever reason we have decided that something that we take as constitutive of health
Mhm.
and is constitutive of wellness, and we can say, oh, for whatever reasons, and we say, oh, well, we could intervene here to change something so that memory loss is, decreased. Why can't I? It's useful, I guess. What I would say is a sort of role function conception is useful in identifying, what a mechanism is for a role, and then just to say, oh, well, this one's not working so well relative to that role.
Yeah.
So it's
Maybe there's an appearance of disagreement here where there is none. I think that's possible. The only thing that I would say about it is that, just what I said a second ago, that's obviously normative. And I have no problem with psychiatry, I think, owning the parts of itself that are in fact normative, because then you can have an open question and an open debate about what the best way is to structure a society or an economy or whatever else it is. But the problem that I have is with packing all the normative stuff into a mechanism that supposedly is purely descriptive or purely scientific and not normative. So if they were to do that openly, I would say, great, let's have the debate.
right. Maybe the way to put it that might help you is you made the point, rightfully so, about the problem of role functions is that you could take any particular thing and you can say, oh, it's doing that, and there's no way to select the right ones. And I'm saying that thing is entirely normative, but once you've selected something from this normative perspective, you could sort of ask, well, is the mechanism working, or is it not, or is there intervention possible?
I'm not even sure that's true. And I'm sorry to stand here and argue with you, but that's why we're here, right? Then I think you might run into the kind of problem that Cooper articulates with Bortz's account, which is like, what are the appropriate reference classes to divide people into? So how do you figure out whether some mechanism in a person is functioning correctly? What class of people do you compare them to? So like for me, would you ask the same set of questions about you and me, because I'm a woman? Or would it be more appropriate to interpret the proper functioning in a more narrowly delineated way? And how do you figure out what the appropriate reference classes are? So I think I like the suggestion, but I think it runs into a different set of problems that Borst has with his account, but not necessarily that Wakefield has with his.
Okay, we better let somebody.
One final question.
Picking up with the disability theme from Bree.
Could you speak up a little bit? I can't really hear
Sure. Picking up on the disability angle from Bree and
Yeah.
also your response, I think an interesting case study is autism, right?
Yeah.
Because you have a breakdown of, quote unquote, right, with regard to social interaction, language communication, and restricted interests. An argument can be made, a cogent argument can be made that language and social interaction are adaptive and have been selected for part of our important feature of human a human evolutionary natural selection path. But these same issues still arise, right? Even though we have a set of adaptive traits, we still have these questions, right? I mean, you made reference to extreme cases being something that we need to have a medical model for, but we still debate this, right? About
Right.
how, when it's appropriate to think of somebody on the spectrum as having sort of dysfunction in a profound sense. So I wanted to know what you thought of that.
I'm trying to wrap my head around what the question is. Maybe could you repeat
It's
it?
an instance where we have an adaptive story, but we still don't get an answer to the question we want regarding dysfunction.
So there is an adaptive story, but there is no answer to the question of whether or not it's
We still have questions about dysfunction.
whether it's dysfunctional. Yeah. I mean, I guess what I would say in cases like that, given the kinds of mechanisms that you described that are disrupted in cases of more severe autism, I mean, what I would kind of want to ask is why is it that, like, what is it that separates, what is it that makes those things specifically psychiatric and not cognitive or something else? Like, I'm not sure that there is a way of taking cases like that and distinguishing between problems that are happening at a more general level and then things that are purely psychiatric. Like what I think you would need would be some story. If you want a selected effects account, you would need some story that explains why those things are adaptive for specifically psychiatric functions and not other sorts of things. And I'm not sure you would get that in a case like the one you described. There's more to say, but we'll talk more, I'm sure.
Let's thank our speaker.
Thank you all.
So it's lunchtime, so we're going till 1:15.